allies and all those countries who are facing Russia aggression. How many times have I stood up here and told you what I think about Vladimir Putin? Vladimir Putin does not share our interests. Vladimir Putin does not share our values. We just conducted a year-long investigation into Russia's interference in our elections. They did interfere in our elections. It's really clear. There should be no doubt about that. It's also clear that it didn't have a material effect on our elections. But as a result of that, we passed tough sanctions on Russia so that we can hold them accountable. I understand the desire and the need to have good relations. That's perfectly reasonable, but Russia is a menacing government that does not share our interests and it does not share our values, and I think that should be made very, very clear. Sherman.
And we're going to take you now to Capitol Hill, where Democratic leaders from both the House and the Senate are speaking. This is Nancy Pelosi. Let's listen in.
Negotiation and also signing the accord. It's strange and disturbing and, again, heartbreaking that President Trump threw out the values that were the basis of the Helsinki Commission when he was cowering before President Putin yesterday. Instead of standing up for our democracy and democratic principles, President Trump cowered in the presence of Putin, and the entire world watched and saw that. Trump's eagerness to sell out America proves the Russians must have something, personally, politically, or financially, on President Trump. As DNI Dan Coates has said, the intelligence community has stated the Russians are once again waging a campaign to interfere in our elections. But President Trump continues to take the word of Russians, enthusiastically embracing their excuses, and and the president gave a green light to continue to attack our democracy to the Russians. Yesterday, the president sided with the enemy who made an assault on our democracy. Disturbingly, it appears that the House Republicans have chosen to side with the enemy, too. All year, the Republicans in Congress have wasted our time with weak words and sham hearings. And today, they are pushing to eliminate funding for states to protect their electoral systems. Mr. Kogi will speak to that momentarily, and thank you for your leadership. Democrats are moving to force a vote to restore that funding, to helping states enhance their election equipment, counter cyber attacks, and defend against future intrusions on the financial services, and that will happen on the financial services bill. We also want to protect the integrity of the Mueller investigation, and our colleagues will speak to that as well. We early on, under the leadership of Congressman Eric Swalwell, proposed an independent commission to review what happened in the last election and finding out to ensure that it would not happen again. Republicans in Congress have resisted that call as well. Perhaps now, with the damaging, disgraceful, so sad performance of the president yesterday, the Republicans will see the light and respond to some of the initiatives that Democrats have been putting forth for a while now, honoring, respecting the confidence of the Intelligence Committee in their assessment that the Russians were involved in the disruption of our election. We'll see, and the integrity of our democracy is at stake. We must protect it. An assault on our democracy is an assault on our country. We have no time to waste to protect our country. And with that, with great pride, I'm pleased to yield to a ranking member on the Intelligence Committee, a person who has stood tall and strong and showed us a path on how we can work together in a bipartisan way to do just that, protect our country, Congressman, Ranking Member Adam Schiff. Schiff?
Madam Leader, I thank you. As many of you know, Leader Pelosi served as the ranking member on the Intelligence Committee, and as an ex officio member, has a longer tenure on this committee than any other member of the House. We are gathered, the current and former members of the Intelligence Committee, to express our strong support for the men and women of the intelligence community who were denigrated by the president's performance yesterday, whose work, difficult work, often life-risking work, was undermined by the chief executive of the country, who disregarded their conclusions, who essentially sided with the perpetrator of the election interference rather than siding with his own Justice Department and intelligence community. We have worked closely with the men and women of the IC cumulatively for decades and decades. We have the greatest respect for the work that they do, and to see that their work product would be so cavalierly discarded was something that shocked us all. But what the president did yesterday in Helsinki went beyond disrespecting the men and women of the intelligence community. It was a wholesale betrayal of the values and interests of this country. Ronald Reagan once said that he didn't leave the Democratic Party left him. Had there been any doubt, it was removed yesterday. The Republican Party has left Ronald Reagan. There is nothing left of his legacy in the GOP as represented by this president. This president said yesterday that as between the word of his own intelligence director and the word of Vladimir Putin, who strongly asserted that he was not responsible for the election hacking, he didn't know who to believe except that he can't imagine why the Russians would have done what they did. I do not, for one, believe that the president could possibly be so naive as to take the word of this former KGB operative. I believe the president somehow feels this is in his personal self-interest. His only ideology is self. But whatever the motivation is, the result is clear and unequivocal, and that was a denigration of our country, its justice system, its intelligence community, its values, its alliances. He is realigning our country not with fellow democracies, but with fellow autocrats. And as men and women who have served with our intelligence community to help strengthen democracies and democratic institutions around the world and to fight authoritarian regimes who would undermine the freedoms of people around the world, that was an unprecedented betrayal. And so I'm proud to join with my colleagues in condemning what we saw and voicing our strong support for the men and women of the IC and the unparalleled work product that they produce. I thank you, Madam Leader.
Mr. Ruppersberger.
My great pleasure to introduce my predecessor, Dutch Ruppersberger, a wonderful former ranking member and probably someone who represents more of the IC than just about anyone else.
Thank you. Thank you, Leader Pelosi, for bringing us together. The first thing, I want to reiterate to all of my colleagues that we stand behind the intelligence community. Intelligence has been said one of the best defenses against terrorism, nuclear weapons, all of the issues that we deal with. I represent NSA, so I spend a lot of time dealing with cybersecurity. And when President Trump first was elected, I sent him a letter, and I said to him that as President of the United States, you need to make sure you know the threat of cyber attacks, one of the most serious threats we have other than maybe nuclear weapons. And I never got a call back. It was as if he didn't care. Now, I want to talk about the Putin's suggestion with our president about the task force. And this task force coming together with our country is clearly an attempt for Russia to be recognized as an equal peer in cyberspace, of which they are not. The U.S. has nothing to gain by jointly investigating anything with Russia officials in cyberspace unless the president bluntly shows that evidence that Special Counsel Mueller put into plain English for him on Friday must be addressed with Putin. The indictment by the Department of Justice clearly lays out Russian efforts to influence the democratic process in this country. And it is clear that our president's performance yesterday, when he was in Putin's palm, that he is unable to confront Russia on anything. Now, the task force is not necessarily for the purposes of investigating what happened in 2016. We know what happened in 2016. A task force would only bolster the green light our president has given by Putin by giving them greater insight into our investigations, mindset, and playbooks. If they want to collaborate and show that they will properly act with us going forward, so-called cyber norms, I think it's a conversation our State Department is already having. and one which started in previous administrations, and that Trump should support that effort instead of denouncing it. This really is about our democracy and the rule of law in the United States of America. And when you attack our democracy, we must call you out for that on the national stage. And I'd like to introduce Terry Sewell, who I served together on the Intelligence Committee. So, Terry.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm honored to stand here with current and former members of the Intelligence Committee. As the proud representative of Selma, Alabama, I have to tell you there is nothing more heartbreaking to me than a president who refuses to stand up for our democracy in the face of overwhelming evidence that our elections were under attack. 2 years after we first learned of Russia's hack of the DNC, we now know more about the full breadth of Russia's attack. We know that Russia targeted our election infrastructure itself and hacked computer networks containing voter information. We know that Russia's actors posted more than 3,000 advertisements on Facebook in an attempt to influence our elections. They were so bold as to sponsor pages that were named Black Activists and paid for it in no less than rubles. Their sole purpose was to sow swords of discord throughout our nation. We have to guess that they did so because they knew that having a covert influence campaign would have an effect on our election. We know that Russia specifically targeted minority voters in an attempt to sow discord in the American public and encourage minority voters to stay at home. Yes, Russia's attack was no less than voter suppression.
And we want to turn now to Senate Republicans who are speaking to reporters. Let's listen in.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's important for the Europeans to know how the Senate Republican majority feels about the structures that were painstakingly set up over decades that have worked to maintain world peace and to have some process by which we can enter into trade agreements and other things. So I just think it was important for for our friends and allies to hear from us.
There's a lot of chatter in the other body about impeaching Rod Rosenstein. Are you concerned about that? And of course, if they were to forge ahead, there would be the potential for a Senate trial. How would you handle that?
I'm not going to address a hypothetical like that. I think it's pretty far-fetched and probably not worthy of comment at this point. Yeah.
Given your comments at the top and comments to Nancy, do you feel like there's trust with you and with the Republican conference with how the president has approached Europe, how the president has approached Russia over the course of the last 10 days?
Look, I'm not here to critique anyone else. I'm here to speak it for myself, and you've heard from others this morning who are standing behind me about our views about our friends and allies. And I want them to understand that in this country, there are a lot of people in both parties who believe that these alliances, painstakingly built in the wake of the end of World War II, are important, and we want to maintain them.
Leader McConnell, is there anything that Congress can or will do to support those alliances or to push back on Russia or the president's comments about Russia other than just offering words of support?
Well, I mean, there are some possibilities. Senator Rubio, for example, has got a bill that targets the 2018 election, the cycle we're right in now, with, as I understand it, potential penalties if the Russians do it again. So, yeah, there's a possibility that we may well take up legislation related to this. In the meantime, I think the Russians need to know that there are a lot of us who fully understand what happened in 2016, and it really better not happen again in 2018.
On trade.
We were just listening to Mitch McConnell addressing the president's performance in Helsinki. We're going to go back now to the Senate Democrats who are also criticizing President Trump's performance. Let's listen in.
Their work on behalf of our great nation. It's because of the men and the women of the intelligence community that we have evidence not only of Russia's interference in our election, but also the illegal annexation of Crimea and the invasion of the Ukraine, Russian arms transfers to Syria, and Russia's illegal trade with North Korea. Putin is not our friend. We can't trust him, and we must not allow the sanctions against Putin to slip in any way, shape, or form. The president missed the opportunity yesterday to stand up to Putin and to stand up for America and for our values. His behavior yesterday was reprehensible. Reprehensible. We need to make sure that we stand up strong against Putin, keep these sanctions in place, and keep close watch on our American values and our American future. And now I'm proud to introduce and ask to come to the podium Representative Mike Quigley from the great state of Illinois.
Good afternoon. The Russians attacked our democratic process, and they will be back. The real truth is they never left. We have to ask ourselves if we are prepared, and the short answer is we are not. 40 states have election equipment that's over a decade old, ill-fit to handle modern anti-hacking software. 13 states use equipment that doesn't even have a paper trail to it. So when you electrically scan your vote, there is no way to audit after the fact just exactly what, if anything, was done to that equipment. We are extraordinarily vulnerable. Secretary Johnson, in testifying before our committee, mentioned the fact that most entities don't know that they've been hacked. Most entities have to be told by someone else that they've been hacked. And usually it's 1.5 to 2 years before they know that it's taken place. We are that vulnerable. 9,000 entities operate federal elections, folks, and they range from municipalities the size of Mayberry all the way to large counties and state boards of election. Dozens of them were hacked prior to the last election, including my own state of Illinois in August of 2016. In an attempt to address this, the last time we had an election catastrophe, this government spent $3.5 billion after Bush Gore. Why? Because we treasure the democratic process. And no matter who wins, we want to know that it was a fair game. We're not in that position anymore. In 2018, we spent $380 million out of the Appropriations Committee.
CBS News political correspondent Ed O'Keefe is in Washington and joins us now. Ed, I know that you've been listening in as well as we have. I want to go back to some of the things that Nancy Pelosi addressed at the beginning. She called President Trump's performance disgraceful, damaging, so sad. But she also said that this was proof that the Russian government must have something over the president, either personally, politically, or economically. She's certainly not the first person to bring that up, but that's a pretty big accusation. Is there anything that we have that could back up something like that?
No, there isn't, and we should point out to our viewers who may be hearing that for the first time that she actually has said this quite often in recent months. She said it last week in the same exact room during her weekly newser. She said it in a statement earlier this week. She has said it in interviews in the past, and she just continues to say it. But when you ask her, where you ask her people, does she have any proof of this, especially given that she is the longest serving member of the House or Senate Intelligence Committee right now and would certainly have the means to find out, or at least to ask, they demur and they don't give us the specifics. So right now, at least, it's an accusation, without proof, and probably should be treated as such unless she'd like to provide us with some specifics.
Now, Representative Schiff went on to say that the president is realigning our country not with fellow democracies, but with fellow autocrats. Now, that's, again, a very strong statement, and it is one which there is perhaps a little bit of evidence for, especially after this Helsinki Summit.
Well, yeah, I guess some could suggest that, and there have been reports about his interactions with the Turkish president or prime minister while they were together at the NATO summit as well, and that he was sort of being complimentary about the way he runs things in Turkey. Look, I think a lot of that remains in the eye of the beholder. One of the other interesting things there that Schiff, the top Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, did there, though, was make the point that the Republican Party, in essence, has moved on from the era of Ronald Reagan, who, of course, is remembered for talking tough and taking on the Soviet Union. We've seen that from a lot of Democrats in recent days, as the president has said these kinds of things or done these kinds of things regarding Putin and regarding Russia. And I think what you're going to continue to see between now and November is a real appeal to disaffected Republicans who may be drifting right now, unclear about who exactly they should be supporting given what the president has done. And they're really trying to capture what they believe could be a segment of the voting population that may be looking for an alternative this November. And frankly, they may be also trying to draw back Democrats who vote Republican. Let's remember there are a lot of them that did that in 2016. Reagan Democrats have been a thing ever since the 80s, and I think they understand that there may now be a big opening given what the president said yesterday, and given that the country is still sort of processing what exactly was done and said in Finland, which of course could change on a dime here any second now when we see whatever it is the president has to say for himself at the White House in a meeting he's having right now with Republican members of Congress.
But Ed, you know, looking at the Republican Party being hard on Russia certainly predates Ronald Reagan. I mean, this has been a Republican policy since before the Cold War. So I would imagine that many Republicans today are having a little bit of an identity crisis.
Yeah, I mean, certainly you listen to Republicans on the Hill, and you've got some who obviously are quite conflicted by what's gone on here. But I don't think we're really going to have a good measure of it for a little while yet. We're going to have to see polling. We're going to have to continue to do reporting across the country and really get a sense from people of whether or not this resonated, whether this was a big deal to them or whether this was just another thing that the president says. We should point out that while these House Democrats are speaking, and we saw a little bit of the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, the Republican in Kentucky, he started his remarks, his weekly remarks to reporters, by reassuring European allies that the United States remains an ally of theirs, and that Russia is not. And it's just telling that we continue to have to see senior congressional leaders today go out of their way publicly to reiterate what has been longstanding U.S. policy, and that is that we align ourselves more with European and Western powers than we do with Russia, who is considered a big foe.
Yes, it was interesting to see, you know, Mitch McConnell address it because, of course, for each congressional Republican, there has to be some response, which they have to craft rather carefully.
Yeah, and look, they don't want to go as far as John McCain did, or Jeff Flake, or even to some extent Mitt Romney yesterday in their comments, but they do sort of need to reiterate to their own supporters, to skeptics around the world, that in their view at least, the U.S. policy hasn't changed, and they are not in agreement with the president on what he was doing and saying yesterday.
Do you think the Senate has an appetite at this point to increase sanctions against Russia?
You know, it was interesting that McConnell got asked that, and I think we aired that part of it, and he said that when it comes to legislation, perhaps there is a way to sort of warn Russia that they will be punished yet again, or there would be new sanctions, should there be any evidence that they mingled, meddled, colluded, tried to disrupt the 2018 midterm elections. And that, you know, potential legislation would come as both lawmakers and intelligence officials have said that Russia is indeed trying to do things similar to what it did in 2016. So if anything, it might stave off further action by Russia, but certainly would be a strong response from Congress towards what Russia is trying to do. But there's no definitive, concrete plan to do anything just yet. Nothing has been scheduled. And yet telling that Republican leaders in both chambers haven't ruled it out.
And it's also will be interesting to see what the president's response is to all of this criticism. When he has been criticized before for being weak on Russia, he came out with some sanctions against Russians. So sometimes he responds to criticism by actually doing something.
Right, or sometimes just by doubling down.
Right.
So we'll just have to see here. And we're getting guidance that he has begun speaking to reporters at the White House. The way this works is we won't see it until the tape of it is able to be played back to all of us, frankly. But he is in a previously scheduled meeting with a handful of House Republicans to discuss what the White House calls tax reform 2.0. And then guidance came from the White House press office a little while ago that he was going to allow reporters to come in and address essentially what he said and did yesterday in Finland yet again. That seems to be a somewhat swift response from him and from the White House in regards to what has been a pretty critical reaction to what he said in Finland. And so what exactly he's saying, we don't quite know yet, but we do have guidance from reporters in the room that he is speaking. Why can't we see it live? It's a matter of logistics. It's just that they can't necessarily run a power cord all the way into the room wherever he is and then out to the satellite dishes. So they'll run back as quickly as they can and load up the tape, and we'll see it.
That's right. We'll be playing it we'll be playing it here as soon as we get it. So Ed O'Keefe, thank you so much for that insight. We're going to take a quick break once again as we await remarks from President Trump at the White House regarding the fallout from his summit with Russian President Putin. You're streaming CBSN. We're going to take you now to Capitol Hill, where Democratic Senator Chuck Schumer is speaking. Let's listen in.
Security team that was in Helsinki and any others who might be privy to what happened. We're worried about what the president said publicly. We're even more worried about what happened in those 2 hours when the president was alone with Mr. Putin. Does anyone believe that he was tougher on Putin in secret than he was publicly? Why did he not want anyone else in the room if he was so sure and confident that what he did would stand the light of public scrutiny? So we need these people to come. We need Secretary Pompeo. There's some talk he may, but there's been no commitment that we have seen. And we want DNI Coates, Ambassador Huntsman, and many others to come before us. This is too important not to get the full story out before the Senate and the American people. Next, where are the notes from that meeting, the contemporaneous notes? What did the President agree to? Was Secretary Pompeo briefed afterwards? Did he write anything down? Were any other members of the President's team? The contemporaneous notes that were taken, particularly in regard to the 2-hour closed meeting, should be turned over to Congress immediately. I'm calling on Leader McConnell and his leadership team to immediately request a hearing with the people I mentioned, Pompeo, Coates, Huntsman, and the rest of the national security team. And I'm calling on Leader McConnell to join us in demanding the contemporaneous notes that were taken. Next, our Republican friends must end the attacks on the Department of Justice. Want to pass legislation? Yes. The most important legislation we can pass, given the President's attitude, is the bipartisan bill to protect the special counsel that Senators Coons, Booker, Tillis, and Graham authored, along with Senators Whitehouse and Blumenthal, and that passed the Judiciary Committee. Put it on the floor immediately. Immediately. If you mean what you say, Leader McConnell. If you're going to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. Fourth, the President must release his tax returns and insist on the extradition of the 12 Russians indicted for election interference. We need, given all of the innuendo, this President should have released his tax returns before he was elected. But what happened yesterday makes that release imperative. He should do it. Our Republican colleagues should join us in asking him to do it. And finally, we must move to protect our election security. To its credit, the Senate, in bipartisan fashion, led by some of the people around me and many others,
and we're now starting to get a sense of what President Trump is saying at the White House regarding his summit with President Putin. President Trump is currently meeting with Republican members of Congress to talk about tax reform, but the fallout from Helsinki came up. The president said he has, quote, full faith and support for America's intelligence agencies. We're still awaiting his full remarks, but we're now starting to get bits and pieces of what he said. CBS News political correspondent Ed O'Keefe is in Washington and joins us now. Ed, you're reading the same pull note as I am and trying to glean some sense out of it. It looks as if at least he is, showing faith in America's intelligence agencies, which is a good thing.
He seems to be saying on camera what he's been tweeting about since he boarded his flight home yesterday, Tanya. Now reiterating that he has full faith and support, as you said, in the U.S. intelligence community, saying that this was a successful meeting with NATO, in part because he's gotten member nations to pay more than $44 billion more on top of what they used to do. Said he had great meetings with the Queen, who he called a terrific person. It was inspiring to see her. But apparently he also says that the most successful visit had to do with Russia. They were attempting to tackle some of the most pressing issues facing humanity, and getting along with Russia would be a good thing. We read what are very rough notes that are sent by the reporters in the room where he is, and then the tape comes back out to the press room and it plays back. And so we're just waiting for that. But in essence, he seems to be doubling down somewhat and just reiterating more clearly and certainly differently than he did during the press conference yesterday that he has full faith in the U.S. intelligence community, which it seems, at least at the first blush, was one of the biggest knocks that he got from critics in the wake of that press conference.
Ed, I want to point out that some wires just came across Reuters that say Trump says he made progress on conflicts with Putin during that private meeting that they had. He says progress on conflicts, discussed the Middle East. Again, we're looking for more insight into that private 2-hour conversation. We don't yet really know exactly what they discussed, but according to Reuters, Trump says they discussed Syria, the Iran nuclear ambitions during that meeting. So we're getting a little bit of insight into it.
Yeah. But I think the headline coming out of this, at least, will be that he now says in a more direct fashion that he accepts the findings of the U.S. intelligence community, which he failed to do yesterday when the world was watching. And whether this will resonate as widely remains to be seen. But clearly he understands now, if he didn't already, that that was important for him to say. He's meeting with a collection of House Republicans. They're scheduled, at least, to talk about what the White House billed as Tax Reform 2.0. Among those leading the delegation from the Capitol is Kevin Brady, who's the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee. But obviously, the president was eager to invite in reporters to discuss this issue, that the issue that has dominated conversation across the country since he returned, and that is what he did and said in Helsinki yesterday. And again, he is reiterating now on camera what it looks like he was tweeting about earlier today and last evening, which is that, you know, don't forget what we did at NATO. We got them to pay more. Don't forget that I met with the Queen and had a great time with her. And in my view, he says, Russia, the meeting with Russia was the most important part of this, and he thinks it went well. And oh, by the way, I think, or I accept the findings of the U.S. intelligence community. Whether he's going to do more about it because he now accepts it remains to be seen. And that's why you saw there a little earlier congressional Democrats sort of doubling down on this theory that the administration now has to be forthcoming about what exactly was said, what was assured, what was promised in that meeting to the extent they know it, and what more is there to know about the president and his potential, as they continue to allege, a relationship with either President Putin or Russians generally. Calls to release his tax returns. That's hearkening back to 2 summers ago when Democrats were insisting on it and he refused. And I suspect that most of those Democratic demands will fall on deaf ears over at the White House.
Calls to release his tax returns and also calls to demand the extradition of those 12 Russians who were indicted.
Right, which is, it isn't clear if he did that yesterday. You know, because he stopped at the point that he said, I brought it up, Putin denied it. So it wasn't clear whether he or Secretary Pompeo or anybody else really raised that issue with Russians. It came up in the interview with Chris Wallace on Fox News, and Putin said, well, you know, don't see a need to do it, and I'd rather see U.S. and Russian officials working together on joint investigations. But the idea of extraditing these guys doesn't appear to have been breached quite seriously with Russian officials yesterday.
I also want to point out that according to Reuters, Trump says he meant to say in Helsinki that he saw no reason why it would not be Russia that interfered in elections.
Yes, and he says here also now, my administration will stop it and repel at any efforts to interfere in our elections. So he's sort of suggesting now that they're going to try to do more.
Although,
what can be done and how quickly, though, with the elections fast approaching, that's unclear.
Right, and as Representative Quigley pointed out, there are so many state election systems that are so vulnerable, so antiquated, that, you know, are there efforts being made to update these? What is the federal government doing at this point?
Well, given that the intelligence community knows or says that there are attempts underway, one can surmise they're doing something, but we don't quite know what that is.
Right.
It's because U.S. election systems are so decentralized. You know, different neighborhoods, different counties, different states all vote differently. It's going to be very hard to police and monitor that, and it may not be known until after the fact. But if the warnings from intelligence officials are to be believed, it's happening again. And so it's just a question of whether state officials are catching this and what they may be doing to try to stop it. There have been bipartisan proposals to spend a lot of money at the federal government, at the federal level at least, to help the states keep an eye on this and do something to stop it. That money hasn't necessarily started trickling down. And Homeland Security has been holding meetings with state secretaries of state and other officials that oversee elections to talk about this. But I recall hearing from some state officials who said they haven't gotten necessarily clear guidance on what they should be looking for or what exactly they should be doing in order to potentially stop new threats.
So, Ed, all of what seems to be coming out of the president's remarks today seems to be an attempt to sort of walk back at least the optics a little bit.
Right.
Will Democrats buy that, do you think?
No, I don't think they will. I think nothing short of doing the 4 things that they're now calling for, which are unlikely to happen, is going to please them. And look, if administration officials come to the Capitol as early as next week to explain what went on and maybe shed a little more light on what happened, at least they'll have that. if anything, a chance to publicly scold these officials for letting the president have a private meeting with the Russian leader. But
what about Republicans? Will the ones that were so vocally critical of the president, will they buy it?
I'm sure some will, but the fact that you had to see the House Speaker and the Senate Republican leader go out today and reiterate that they believe Western powers, Western countries, Europe is more of an ally than Russia should tell you everything you need to know. That they shouldn't have to be doing that, but they felt the need to do it today.
All right. CBS News political correspondent Ed O'Keefe, thank you so much for your insight. We have Zeke Miller on the phone now. He's a White House correspondent for the Associated Press and a CBSN political contributor. Zeke, so it seems that President Trump is saying a little bit of, wait, you heard me wrong here. I meant to say that I saw no reason why it would not be Russia that interfered in the elections. A sort of, I wasn't, no one heard me correctly. The media misreported. Is that what you're understanding?
My understanding is the president basically said he wanted to clarify his remarks, saying he meant to say that that I don't see any reason why it wouldn't be Russia, when in fact, when he said yesterday, I don't see any reason why it would be. That being the president bowing to this massive outcry we've seen from both Republicans and Democrats in Washington and across the globe. Criticism of the president's comments where he publicly doubted U.S. intelligence agencies, and now the president today is saying he has full confidence in U.S. intelligence agencies, and in fact misspoke when he was with Vladimir Putin yesterday. That is a striking step down by this president, who has been so unwilling in public settings before to admit error, and here he is appearing to admit error, at least in this one instance.
And he also is now putting his support behind the Intelligence Committee, or at least expressing his support for the U.S. intelligence community, correct?
That is our understanding as well, and we should be getting the audio and video here in just a few seconds. But yeah, the president saying he has confidence in the leaders of the intelligence community that he put in place, sort of a knock on the folks who were there during the Obama administration. But still, the assessment that the Russian meddled in the 2016 election is one that has been maintained also by the president's intelligence officials. So for him to make that claim now is bowing to criticism, not just from the outside, but also frustration internally that he was undercutting morale of the people who work for him in those national security roles.
And he also said something a little bit interesting. He said that U.S.-Russia, the relationship, has gotten substantially better. That's something, obviously, that a lot of people would not agree with.
Yeah, there's really not a whole lot of evidence to that. The president doing a little bit of explaining about what they actually discussed in that one-on-one meeting. They discussed Iran, they discussed North Korea, they discussed nuclear non-proliferation, things like that, which there are areas where the U.S. and Russia could begin to cooperate with each other. But we haven't really seen any evidence of a real, warming of ties in any specific instance there. But at the same time, the president did also maintain that there was going to be no lifting of sanctions on Russia. And that was obviously something that Vladimir Putin has been pushing for years, and it seems he did not secure that in yesterday's summit.
He also said, apparently, that his administration will move aggressively to repel any efforts to interfere in the 2018 election. But there were no details on what those moves might look like, correct?
There were not a whole lot of details there about what the president has in mind there, or how he intends to try to sort of push back against the efforts that the U.S. intelligence agencies assess the Russian government continues to try to go about in the 2018 election. So there are a lot of still unanswered questions here as the president trying to walk back the damage that he did to himself yesterday in Helsinki.
And do you think that what he has said today will undo some of the damage? I mean, certainly not in the eyes of Democrats, but do you think it will at least appease Republicans?
Certainly, this will, this won't end criticism from Democrats or Republicans the way the president approaches Russia, and certainly the press conference, making an error, the president admitting that he made an error like this on that stage. There will be lasting damage of that he will certainly face criticism for a very long time. But in terms of the acute pressure that was on him earlier this morning and this afternoon, as it appeared he was doubling down on his comments yesterday, that some of that will ease in the coming days and hours. But certainly there will be there will still be questions and criticisms that he will face, for years over yesterday.
And according to the notes coming out of what the president said today, he apparently spoke a little bit about what he and President Putin discussed in private there. He said they discussed Israeli security, they discussed Iran nuclear ambitions, they discussed North Korea. Any other details coming to light?
They discussed a little bit about North Korea, where the president said that Vladimir Putin was supportive of U.S. efforts to try to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula. Not a whole lot of specifics on what they actually accomplished there. Just a lot of vague sort of we discussed this, we discussed that, and those are all issues that the president really didn't discuss yesterday. If you recall in that press conference, Vladimir Putin was literally brought up saying that described the president's position on Crimea, saying the U.S. does not recognize Russia's annexation of Crimea, and saying the Russian government disagrees. Here, the president sort of really trying to, a day late, trying to put his spin on the nature of that summit yesterday.
And so what is your take, Zeke, on what the president is trying to do today? I mean, he usually stands his ground and doubles down in the face of criticism, at least in the short term. What is your analysis of his response to the criticism he's received?
I mean, this is certainly a day late. The question is will this also be a dollar short? Will this be enough to quell the criticism that he has faced, to put an end to this, the bipartisan sense of frustration over the way the president has addressed Russian policy for over a year and a half now? And that may be too soon to tell, but this is a rare admission of error by this president, who so often the playbook we've seen whenever he's made mistakes before. He has gone back and sort of doubled down. He is not here, partly because of just how glaring the errors he made yesterday were. So this is a striking moment by this president. We'll see is it enough to actually to put this to rest.
It was interesting that he also addressed his meeting with the Queen, another meeting that he said a terrific person, very inspiring to see. So he talked about other things as well, not just Helsinki.
Yeah, he sort of tried to put a positive spin on the entire trip. Obviously, there's still criticism of the way the president treated NATO allies. In Brussels, the way he treated Prime Minister May in the Kingdom, the president sort of claimed this is a great trip. And even as he was walking back his comments about the Russian component in Helsinki, he was saying that was the most successful part of his trip. So still trying to put a positive spin on a trip that has been widely panned here in the United States.
Right. We still have Ed O'Keefe with us. Ed, I'm just going to bring you back, if you don't mind. The president did say that he has full faith and support in the intelligence communities, but he also said Russia's actions had no impact. Let me be clear. He seems to want to make sure that those two statements are attached.
Well, and look, the assessment so far, and the Justice Department reiterated this last week in the indictments, is that while Russians did attempt to meddle, they did not change the results. And it's that part, the potential changing of results or any effect on the results, that seems to be the most sensitive aspect of this to the president. He doesn't want any suggestion that he didn't do it on his own, that he didn't win outright. And that, if you read the reporting of our colleagues who talk to aides more closely than you and I do,